My beloved child, don't skip. Listen carefully, because this fictional story begins on a quiet night when one misunderstanding has quietly lasted far longer than either heart ever imagined. Stay until the very end, because what unfolds next is not a prediction about your life or your future. It is a fictional story about love, forgiveness, healing, and discovering that silence often hides feelings much deeper than words ever reveal. Sometimes people do not stop caring. Sometimes they simply stop believing they are still welcome. The evening settled gently across the town as soft rain tapped against bedroom windows and warm lights glowed inside peaceful homes. Most people had already ended their day, but one person remained awake, sitting beside a small wooden desk with an old photograph resting quietly between their hands. For months they had convinced themselves that someone important had finally moved on. Every unanswered message, every missed conversation, and every season of silence slowly became evidence in their mind that love had quietly disappeared. Although they tried accepting that belief, something deep within their heart refused to let go completely. Type 777 if you're praying for God's blessings and trusting His perfect timing. Every night they repeated the same words to themselves. They're happier now. They don't need me anymore. It's better if I simply stay silent. Yet every time they spoke those thoughts aloud, their own heart quietly disagreed. My beloved child, don't skip this part, because the emotional heart of this fictional story begins here. One rainy evening, while helping clean an old family attic, they discovered a forgotten journal that had accidentally been packed away years earlier. Between its worn pages rested an unfinished letter. It had never been mailed. It had never reached its destination. Carefully unfolding the faded paper, they slowly began reading. If you ever wonder why I've become so quiet, please don't mistake my silence for a lack of love. I became silent because I was afraid my words would become another burden you had to carry. Every day I still pray for your happiness. Every success you experience makes me smile, even from far away. If I seem distant, it isn't because my heart changed. It's because I feared yours had. The person stopped reading. Their hands trembled slightly. They quietly whispered. I thought, you stopped loving me. Looking once more at the unfinished letter, tears gently filled their eyes. No. I was completely wrong. For many long minutes they simply remained seated in complete silence, replaying countless memories they had misunderstood. Every thoughtful gesture now carried different meaning. Every quiet goodbye suddenly looked less like rejection and more like hidden sacrifice. They realized how easily fear had rewritten a story that honesty might have told very differently. Type 111 as a sign of faith and gratitude to God. The following morning, they visited the peaceful hillside where they often reflected during difficult seasons. Watching the sunrise slowly brighten the valley below, they quietly admitted something to themselves for the very first time. I wasn't protecting my heart. I was protecting my fear. Those words felt strangely freeing. In this fictional story, what they experienced as God's guidance was not revealing another person's thoughts with certainty. It was the gentle invitation to stop allowing assumptions to become stronger than compassion. They realized that genuine love deserves honest conversations before quiet conclusions. Throughout the following days, they looked at life differently. Instead of assuming the worst whenever silence appeared, they began asking thoughtful questions. Instead of building walls, they slowly rebuilt trust. Instead of replaying old misunderstandings, they focused on becoming someone who communicated with patience, humility, and kindness. They discovered that healing rarely begins when circumstances suddenly change. Healing begins when hearts become willing to understand before judging. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now reveals one of its deepest truths. Sometimes people spend months believing they have been forgotten while another person quietly carries gratitude, respect, and affection they simply never found the courage to express. In this fictional story, what they experienced as God's guidance reminded them that fear often speaks louder than reality until truth finally receives the opportunity to be heard. Honest conversations may not guarantee perfect endings, but they always offer something silence never can: understanding. As another peaceful evening arrived, they folded the unfinished letter carefully and placed it inside a new notebook. This time they wrote only one sentence beneath it. Before believing fear, always give truth the chance to speak. Closing the notebook, they smiled softly toward the quiet stars above. For the first time in many years, they no longer carried the weight of wondering whether love had disappeared. They carried something much stronger: hope. My beloved child, don't skip these closing words, because the next chapter of this fictional journey will reveal what happened when two hearts, each believing they had been forgotten, unexpectedly discovered that neither had stopped caring. They had simply allowed fear to speak louder than love, until one honest conversation changed everything. My beloved child, don't skip this chapter, because in this fictional story, two hearts that spent months believing the worst are finally about to discover how powerful one honest conversation can be. Listen carefully, because misunderstandings often grow quietly while truth waits patiently to be heard. This is not a prediction about your life or anyone else's. It is a fictional story about healing, forgiveness, faith, and learning that genuine love is strengthened not by perfect circumstances but by the courage to communicate with honesty. Type Amen if you're choosing faith over fear. Several peaceful mornings passed after the forgotten letter had been discovered. The person carried it everywhere, not because they wished to remain trapped in the past, but because it reminded them how easily fear can rewrite another person's intentions. Every time they looked at the faded handwriting, they quietly remembered one important lesson: assumptions often become heavier than reality itself. Instead of rushing toward conclusions, they began choosing patience. Instead of allowing silence to speak for someone else, they learned to leave room for understanding. One afternoon, while helping prepare the town square for the annual Community Day celebration, they received an unexpected invitation. A close mutual friend approached with a gentle smile and quietly said, "Someone hopes you'll come tonight." No pressure. No expectations. Just an opportunity to finally speak without fear standing between you. The invitation contained no dramatic promises. Only hope. My beloved child, don't skip this part, because the emotional heart of this fictional story begins here. As evening arrived, warm lanterns illuminated the streets while families gathered beneath colorful lights hanging across the square. Music drifted gently through the cool evening air. Children laughed as they played nearby, and neighbors greeted one another with joyful smiles. Standing near the old fountain at the center of the square, the person quietly waited, their heart beating faster than usual, not from panic, but from the realization that honesty had finally arrived. Moments later, another familiar figure slowly approached. For several seconds neither person spoke. The silence felt completely different now. It no longer carried distance. It carried possibility. Finally, one softly smiled and quietly said, "I spent so many months believing you had stopped caring." The other lowered their eyes for a moment before gently replying, "And I spent those same months believing you wanted me to disappear from your life." Neither defended themselves. Neither blamed the other. Instead, both quietly laughed, not because the misunderstanding had been amusing, but because they suddenly realized how much unnecessary pain fear had created. One softly admitted, "I kept waiting for a sign." The other smiled gently, "So did I." Then came the sentence that neither heart would ever forget. "I never stopped caring." Those simple words carried more healing than hundreds of perfect speeches ever could. In this fictional story, what they experienced as God's guidance was not guaranteeing that every future chapter would be free from challenges. It was the quiet reminder that truth has the power to replace misunderstanding, compassion has the power to soften fear, and humility has the power to rebuild trust one conversation at a time. The evening continued with long, peaceful conversations beneath the glowing lanterns. They spoke honestly about difficult seasons, lessons learned through waiting, and the ways both had quietly changed. Neither wanted to become the people fear had once convinced them to be. They wanted to become people whose relationships reflected patience, forgiveness, honesty, and respect. Later that night, before saying goodbye, they made one simple promise. From today forward, let's never allow silence to answer questions that honesty can answer instead. The other quietly nodded. "I think that's how trust begins. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now reveals one of its deepest truths. Sometimes people believe they have lost love when what they have truly lost is communication. Fear often fills empty spaces with stories that truth never intended to tell. Yet when two hearts choose humility instead of pride, understanding instead of assumptions, and kindness instead of resentment, healing quietly becomes possible." As the final lanterns slowly dimmed beneath the peaceful night sky, both walked home carrying something they had not felt for a very long time. Not certainty. Not perfection. But peace. Because they had finally discovered that honest hearts no longer need fear to speak for them. My beloved child, don't skip these closing words, because the final chapter of this fictional journey will reveal how one unforgettable family gathering becomes the moment when everyone quietly realizes that the greatest miracle was never simply rediscovering one another, it was becoming people whose hearts had learned to choose truth, forgiveness, compassion, and enduring hope over every misunderstanding that once kept them apart. My beloved child, don't skip this chapter, because in this fictional story, the truth that was hidden for so long is finally given the chance to breathe. Listen carefully, because there are moments in life when a single honest conversation carries more healing than months of silent wondering. This is not a prediction about your life or anyone else's. It is a fictional story about forgiveness, understanding, faith, and discovering that love grows strongest when people stop assuming and start listening. Several evenings passed after the forgotten letter had changed everything. Neither heart rushed toward dramatic conclusions. Instead, both quietly reflected upon the lessons they had learned. They understood that rebuilding trust is not accomplished through one emotional conversation alone. It grows through consistent honesty, patient listening, and everyday acts of kindness. Every sunrise became another opportunity to choose understanding instead of fear. One afternoon, an unexpected invitation arrived from a mutual friend. There would be a small gathering at the old lakeside pavilion where neighbors often met to share meals, music, and conversation. The invitation carried no hidden meaning. It simply welcomed everyone to enjoy an ordinary evening together. Yet both quietly wondered whether the other might also attend. My beloved child, don't skip this part, because the emotional heart of this fictional story begins here. As the sun slowly lowered across the peaceful lake, the pavilion filled with warm laughter. Families arranged homemade dishes across long wooden tables. Children chased one another through the nearby field while gentle music floated across the evening breeze. Neither person searched the crowd immediately. Instead, they spent time greeting neighbors, helping elderly guests find comfortable seats, and quietly serving others. Only later, while carrying fresh lemonade toward one of the tables, their eyes finally met. This time, neither looked away. Both smiled. Not because every question had already been answered, but because neither heart carried fear the way it once had. After helping clean the tables later that evening, they found themselves walking slowly along the quiet lakeshore. Reflections of countless stars shimmered gently upon the calm water. One finally broke the silence. I kept believing your silence meant you had stopped caring. The other softly shook their head. My silence came from believing I no longer had the right to tell you how much I still cared. Neither interrupted. Neither hurried to defend past decisions. Instead, they simply listened. For the first time, each understood the fears the other had quietly carried for so long. One smiled gently before saying, "It's strange. We were both protecting each other." The other quietly laughed. "And in doing that, we accidentally protected our fears instead." Both stood quietly watching the peaceful water. Then one softly admitted, "I don't want fear writing another chapter." The answer came almost immediately. "Neither do I." In this fictional story, what they experienced as God's guidance was not removing every uncertainty from the future. It was the gentle reminder that genuine relationships become stronger whenever truth is spoken with humility, forgiveness is offered freely, and patience remains present even while life continues unfolding. As the evening grew quieter, they spoke about ordinary things that suddenly felt deeply meaningful. Family traditions, childhood memories, lessons learned through difficult seasons, dreams they had quietly set aside. Every conversation revealed something new. Not because either person had changed overnight, but because honesty finally had room to grow. Type Amen to get blessing 333. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now reveals one of its deepest truths. Love is rarely destroyed by one difficult season. More often, it becomes hidden beneath assumptions that neither heart intended to create. Yet when people become willing to replace conclusions with conversations, understanding quietly begins where confusion once lived. In this story, what they experienced as God's guidance encouraged them to value humility more than pride and truth more than fear. Before leaving the lakeside, they made no dramatic promises. They simply agreed on something beautifully ordinary. From now on, if something is on our hearts, we'll say it. No applause followed. No extraordinary sign appeared in the sky. Only two peaceful smiles beneath countless stars. Sometimes the simplest promises become the strongest ones. As they walked home beneath the cool evening breeze, both quietly realized they no longer feared tomorrow. Not because tomorrow was guaranteed, but because whatever tomorrow brought, they had finally chosen to face it with honesty instead of silence. My beloved child, don't skip these closing words, because the final chapter of this fictional journey will reveal how one ordinary family gathering quietly becomes the place where everyone recognizes that the greatest miracle was never hidden feelings finally being discovered. It was two hearts learning that truth, patience, compassion, and faithful kindness are the strongest foundations upon which every lasting relationship is built. My beloved child, don't skip these final words, because every chapter of this fictional story has been leading to this peaceful and unforgettable ending. Listen carefully, because what began with silence, misunderstanding, and hidden emotions was never truly a story about losing love. It became a story about two people learning that fear can hide the truth, but it can never erase it. This is not a prediction about your life or your future. It is a fictional story about healing, forgiveness, faith, and the courage to finally choose honesty over fear. Several weeks passed after their conversation beside the lake. Neither person tried to rush the future. Instead, they allowed trust to grow naturally through everyday life. They checked on one another after difficult days, celebrated small victories together, laughed over ordinary moments, and discovered that genuine connection is built quietly. Every honest conversation replaced another old misunderstanding. Every act of patience repaired another small piece of trust that fear had once broken. One bright Saturday afternoon, both families gathered for a neighborhood celebration in the town square. Long tables were covered with homemade meals, children played games beneath colorful ribbons, musicians filled the air with gentle melodies, and neighbors greeted one another with genuine warmth. It felt less like an event and more like a reminder that the simplest moments often become the memories people treasure for the rest of their lives. My beloved child, don't skip this part, because it carries the emotional heart of this fictional story. As the celebration continued, an elderly woman who had quietly watched both of them through the years approached with a warm smile. She gently held their hands for a brief moment before softly saying, "For a long time, each of you believed the other had stopped caring." They both smiled quietly. The woman continued, "But love was never your greatest problem. Fear was. You both loved. You both cared. You both prayed. But neither of you believed your heart was still welcome." Silence gently settled between them. Not the silence that separates people. The silence that finally allows truth to rest peacefully. One quietly looked toward the other and softly admitted, "I wasted so much time believing I had already lost you." The answer came with gentle certainty. And I wasted just as much time believing you no longer wanted me in your life." They both laughed softly. Not because those months had been easy, but because they finally understood how much unnecessary pain fear had created. The elderly woman smiled once more before quietly walking away, leaving only one final sentence behind. "Never allow fear to tell a story that love has not finished writing." Those words remained with them forever. In this fictional story, what they experienced as God's guidance was never about forcing two lives together according to a predetermined plan. It was the quiet invitation to become people who valued honesty more than assumptions, forgiveness more than resentment, and compassion more than pride. The greatest miracle had never been changing another person's heart. It had been transforming their own. Months became years. The notebook containing the unfinished letter remained safely kept upon a bookshelf. Not because it represented regret, but because it reminded them of everything they had learned. Whenever life became difficult, they would quietly reread one sentence written inside. "Before believing fear, always give truth the chance to speak." Those words quietly guided countless future conversations. Their families grew close through shared meals, celebrations, and ordinary evenings filled with laughter. Neighbors often noticed something peaceful about them. Whenever disagreements appeared, they listened before speaking. Whenever mistakes happened, they apologized without delay. Whenever someone nearby struggled, they quietly offered encouragement before being asked. People sometimes wondered what had changed them. Very few knew the answer. It had all begun the day two hearts stopped listening to fear. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now shares its final truth. Love is rarely lost in a single moment. More often, it becomes hidden beneath assumptions, pride, and silence. Yet whenever people choose humility instead of ego, truth instead of fear, patience instead of pressure, kindness instead of resentment, healing quietly begins. Those ordinary choices become the strongest foundation any meaningful relationship can ever have. As another magnificent sunrise stretched across the horizon, both stood together watching the golden light slowly fill the valley below. They no longer wondered whether tomorrow would bring perfect certainty. They had discovered something even better. Peace. Not because every question had been answered, but because they had learned to face every question together with honesty, respect, gratitude, and hope. My beloved child, remember these closing words as this fictional journey comes to its end. Never let fear become louder than truth. Never allow silence to replace conversations that could bring understanding. Tell people they matter while there is still time. Forgive before resentment grows comfortable. Choose kindness even when pride suggests otherwise. Those simple decisions quietly shape lives, restore relationships, and create futures filled with lasting peace. And so, as the morning sun climbed higher into the sky, they walked forward side by side not because life had become perfect, but because they had become wiser. They had learned that the greatest victory was never proving who loved more. The greatest victory was finding the courage to love honestly, listen patiently, forgive freely, and remain faithful to the values that had transformed both of their hearts. And with grateful hearts, peaceful smiles, and hope renewed by every sunrise, this fictional story gently came to its close, reminding every reader that while fear may delay the truth, it never has the final word when kindness, honesty, and love are given the chance to speak.